I'm the host, Perry Bacon. I'm joined today by Ryan Enos. He's a professor of government at Harvard University, and he's been doing a lot of writing and thinking about the sort of democracy crisis we're in. So I want to talk to him about that today. So, Ryan, welcome.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
I want to start with something that I assume you've not done a lot of research and study about, but the East Wing being demolished in the last few days. This is one of the things that it's easy story to remember. It's very visual, obviously. When we think about these democracy stories, where we're going, how radical Trump is the East Wing something that we should think about, or something that's sort of a frivolous thing? Or where do you talk about the East Wing story in comparison talk about the East Wing thing a little bit?
Yeah, it's not frivolous. I mean, it's a fair thing to ask because, of course, in comparison to the grand scheme of what Trump's done, it's maybe not important. The White House will go on with or without the East Wing, and he's killing people without authorization in the Caribbean. He's locking people up and sending them to foreign countries without trial. I mean, those are all obviously more important, but it's not unrelated because what he's doing, and I think this is the most important part of it, of course, is that he is bypassing the law. He's bypassing independent commissions that have been set up to regulate this sort of thing. He's doing what I think is more concerning, which is he is using private money to reshape a public building. And if you think about that, if you think of the limits of that, like could the president spend money to build his own casino in Yellowstone National Park? I mean, could he receive private donations to finance his own police force? And all those things, of course, sound crazy, but this is essentially what he's doing. He's taking something that Congress spends money on for good reason, because it shouldn't be under the private control of the president, and he's spending his own money. And that is a grave violation of the constitutional order. And I think the other thing, which is a little more a little less directly illegal. I mean, it isn't directly illegal, but it's something that I think is worth thinking about. Is it's also disindicative of Trump's vision of America, which is, he wants to build this gaudy, 90,000, is that how big it is, square foot ballroom on the White House, and it's something that is out of character. And I think this is important for the White House. The White House wasn't a palace. Like, this was something that was designed by George Washington approved the designs, and it was a mansion, it was a house, it was not a palace of a European king. But that's kind of the way Trump sees America, or he sees his role in America. And it's a reminder of just how little actually Trump has respect for the good parts of the American tradition, the one that makes it a republic and not some kind of a kingdom in the way he sees it.
Let me probe both those comments you made. So the first one is more, this is an example of him sort of going around laws, regulations. Like, in theory, there's a bunch of people who should have approved this before the
Right.
East Wing was. So that's that's part of it. And part of it you're saying is, the second thing you said is more symbolic in a certain way. Like, that is more like he's treating the White House in a way other presidents have not treated the White House.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I say, the first one is, like many things that Trump does, should be an impeachable offense, or at least one that people are looking into. The president cannot spend money, public or private, in any way he wants. Right? He should be. This is the one thing that the founders gave the Congress more clearly than anything. Right? Because it was something that they were concerned about, because it was exactly what George III was doing, as he was spending money and taxing money without the approval of the legislature, or in some cases without the approval of the British Parliament. And so they said, if you want to have a government that is responsive to the people, you must have the legislature, the ones that can appropriate and tax money. And parenthetically, Donald Trump is going around both those things, because he's imposing taxes on the American people through tariffs in a way that would shock the designers of our Constitution. And he is now spending money, public or private. It doesn't matter. What he's doing is he's essentially changing the structure of public things that are in the public sphere, like the White House, in a way without the approval of Congress or of the other bodies, like the historical commissions that Congress has set up in order for set up as the ones that should regulate this. And the other part of it, as I mentioned, it's just I think when we take a step back, it's important to realize that, and I feel pretty strongly about this, that there's never been an American president that has less respect for the American system or the American tradition of democracy than Donald Trump. And America, I'm not naive. I know America hasn't been a perfect country for all of its history, but there are parts of the American tradition that are admirable. And that is about a tradition of a democracy that's taken us a long time to get to, and we fought really hard to get there. And it is in a democracy, you don't do things like have an unelected king who can build a palace to make himself feel grand. And that's what Donald Trump is doing. He looks at that little White House and he says it's not grand enough for him, right? It's not something, he wants to be he wants to be some sort of Middle Eastern oil baron where he can build himself a palace and impress other rulers and things like that. And that's so out of character for the American tradition. And the thing that is important for reminding ourselves that we're a democracy, and he just fundamentally does not understand that.
Speaking of that, that's what I was going to ask next about, which is like, there was been political scientists like you who've been, other political scientists have used it, have talked about the idea that we're maybe moving toward competitive authoritarianism or we're already there. I think it's generally agreed. I know Brendan Nyan has this like group of scholars who he solicits. It's called the Bright Line Watch, and the group of scholars who say democracy is in some decline in America. Like, where do you, when you're asked, where are we in terms of our democracy? Well, how do you answer that question? Maybe talk about the competitive authoritarianism versus just general decline. Where do you see our democracy right now?
Yeah, it's interesting that you ask because I taught about this in my undergraduate class last week. Because this is a class on political psychology, and we were talking about the psychology of authoritarianism. But in order to frame that, we have to think about, why are we talking about this? What is this moment we're in? And I think it's important, of course, as a scholar, not to be alarmist about these things, right? So I try to be very careful about this, and I thought really hard about how to describe this to my students. And the way I would describe it, of course, is that there's no magic line that you cross, no bright line. And that is the term that we sometimes we use with this bright line watch and such. But there's no bright line that you cross, and you say all of a sudden we're no longer in a democracy. This was the thing that we crossed. And so, it is important to understand that we're in decline, and there's no doubt about that. But if I had to put a label on it, and some people would disagree because there's no bright line, but I think we are no longer in a full democracy, and we're living in a system of competitive authoritarianism.
Okay.
And it's important to understand what that means. And I'll say two things about this. So one is, often the reason we don't recognize this is when we think of authoritarianism, we think of something that's fully non-democratic, where all of the democratic, all of the things that make something a democracy in terms of elections, in terms of civil rights, in terms of things like that, have gone out the window. And we think of a situation like North Korea or China or something like that. That is not the way most democracies go away. They enter the system called competitive authoritarianism, where you have things that are the trappings of democracy, like elections and like some functioning judiciary and things like that. But as the way they say it, the playing field, the ability for the opposition parties, which is a fundamental part of democracy, the playing field has been tilted against them, so they no longer can compete in those elections in a way that actually allows them to challenge the incumbent. And when that happens, the incumbent ruling party, in this case Donald Trump, is no longer responsive to the voters in a way that makes things a true democracy. So he can violate their civil rights, he can abuse the power, he can abuse the Constitution, all these things that we're seeing Donald Trump do. And one indication that we are no longer living in a full democracy is Donald Trump seems perfectly at ease doing these things that normally he would worry about either landing in prison, or he would worry at least ending his political future and the political future of his party. Another thing to think about, I think, in terms of this, and this is something my colleagues Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt have written about this, where they've talked about one measure of whether you're living in a full democracy is whether you have to fear being punished by the government for what you say or for your political actions. And there's no doubt that's where we are. I mean, we've seen, and this happened very early in the Trump administration. I mean, we saw students getting picked up off the street for things they wrote in newspapers. We now, it's gone much further than that. We see people.
Omid and Letitia James.
Yes, exactly. We see Trump's political opponents being prosecuted, right? And that is very clearly a sign that you're no longer living in a full democracy. Now, we're holding on, right? There's a lot of ways to go before we lose our democracy entirely. And if I had to bet, I bet that Comey and James will be found, well, the courts will side with them ultimately. But that also doesn't mean that, because we still have some trappings of an independent judiciary, but that doesn't mean that the damage isn't being done. You can think about, they're not the only ones, right? Of course, Adam Schiff Trump talks about prosecuting him and other Democrats. And when that's the case, he talks about this with Pittsburgh and Illinois, putting them in jail. And when that's the case, what happens is politicians ask themselves, is this worth it, right? Do I want to run against Republicans if there's a chance I'm going to be put in prison or prosecuted? And that's when that playing field starts to be tilted in a way that no longer makes it a fair and fully functioning democracy.
Talk about, so is that what's what's the problem as I'm trying to get at here? But we had massive protests, so that's one thing to think about over the weekend. So we have people are mobilized. The Democrats in Congress are opposing a lot of these things. I would say, is the problem the Republican Party in Congress and in the courts is not sort of reinforcing these traditional barriers?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of problems, right? And the answer to that is always a question of how deep we want to go on these things. I mean, we could talk about deeper structural problems with our democracy that got Donald Trump there in the first place, right? But I think if we have to point more approximately, I think that there are perhaps three things I would point to. One is and I'll get to the Republicans in a minute, so I'm not trying to give them a pass. But I think that Democrats have been somewhat feckless in their opposition to these things, and by this I mean our most senior Democrats in Congress and in other places. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And I think this is they haven't treated themselves as an opposition party. They've said, well, we're going to try to negotiate our way out of these things. We're going to treat Trump like a normal politician, one who can be reasoned with, when he's very clearly not. In some ways, you can't blame them, right? These are people that have been in Washington for a long time, and that's what they're used to. But of course, they've failed us in recognizing the moment in which we're at, where they have to treat themselves as a party that is trying to defend democracy and not trying to just be, an opposition party to a regularly functioning politician. So I think Democrats have failed to meet the moment. I think more importantly, as you mentioned, they're, of course, the Republican Party, and there's lots of reasons for this, like we could talk about. But the Republican Party has abdicated any of their any role they have in defending democracy as well, and essentially become subservient to Donald Trump. So, if you look at the Republican Party now, even compared to 2012, which wasn't that long ago, and even the beginning of the first Trump term, they're an entirely different party ideologically. It's been flipped on its head in some ways. It's not clear if, Donald Trump has an ideology, but it's essentially been subsumed. The party's been subsumed by Donald Trump's electoral ambition. And what that means is and now his ambition to govern the country as an authoritarian. And what that means is that they have not stood up to him in any way whatsoever. Now, as I said, there could be deeper reasons for this that we could discuss. For example, the fact that we have a system set up where primary elections are dominated by a small group of people, and that means that when you have somebody that dominates the party like Donald Trump, ultimately the future of those politicians is beholden to that one leader that dominates those things. Now, in a perfect world, what I'd like to see them do is I'd like them to see them choose honor over their electoral future and choose their democracy and their fellow citizens and say it's more important for me to stand up for democracy than to spend another 2 years in the House of Representatives. But that's not the world we live in, and so they have chosen to stick with their offices rather than stand up to Donald Trump. And if if they would push back, if they would stand up and say no, just it wouldn't take many of them at this point. But we're losing people. We're losing people in the Democratic and the Republican Party that are willing to say no. Most of them are out of office now, right?
Yeah.
So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And the third thing I would mention, I said there was three, is the courts really put us in a tough spot, right? And who knows what the reasons for this is? We're going to be, I think we're in a sad position because we're always trying to psychoanalyze our politicians. And that's one way your democracy has gone wrong is when you're spending your time psychoanalyzing your leaders. And we're going to be talking about John Roberts, for decades as we put our democracy back together. But and so it's not clear if it's because he really believes in a unitary executive or he's just scared of Donald Trump or if he just doesn't know what he's doing. But he very clearly not only first empowered Donald Trump by deciding that a president was was immune to prosecution, and then parenthetically, now that president can turn around and sue people, which seems like a completely unstable equilibrium. But they've also now essentially rubber stamped everything that has come through the Trump administration in a way that would have been really hard to believe. I think it's really hard to convince anybody, and we have pretty direct evidence for this, that they wouldn't have done the same thing with a Democratic administration or even with previous Republicans. Yet here we are. And so there's very few constraints on Trump at this point. It's hard to point what they are. It's not his own party. It's not the courts. And Democrats are proving pretty ineffective in what they're doing.
So I guess if my guess is Schumer and Jeffries with truth serum would say their view is the best way to stop authoritarianism is to win the midterm. So everything they've done has been around trying to say healthcare as much as possible, talk about look at polls, be very careful, be very cautious. Democracy didn't help Kamala Harris win. So I think part of what we're getting at here is like the incentives for a political party in a midterm versus the opposition party defending against an authoritarian are probably different, right? Their electoral strategy may be correct, but you and I might be worried that November 2026 is almost too late.
Yeah, that's right. And look, I don't envy those guys because there's a tension here. Don't get me wrong. And they're right that we should be looking to the midterms, and they at least think they have a formula for how to win those midterms. Now, that's not obvious. It's not obvious. I think this is a standard trope. We go back to the American people that, they care about these bread and butter issues and, they want, it's going to be about healthcare and things like that. And of course, there's reasons to believe that's true. So when I say it's not obvious, I just really mean that. It's not obvious that, what will win things. But I think one thing I would say about that is there is, of course, a lot of evidence that Americans actually want to vote for democracy. Now, I know that sounds strange coming on the heels of Donald Trump, winning in 2024, and we can, discuss that. But we can see, I can cite lots of pieces of evidence for this. One is that Donald Trump is just wildly unpopular. And we have to we have to remember that, and part of that is because of the damage he's done to American democracy, and people respond to that. The sort of colloquial example I give is just even how popular Harvard has become recently, right? And Harvard is a place that nobody likes for for a lot of different reasons, right? I mean, who wants to get behind Harvard? And when it stood up and said no to Donald Trump, and we have some polling evidence on this, that we've actually polled on this, it's one of the most popular institutions in the United States, right? And it's not because everybody suddenly decided they liked elitist education. It's because Harvard was all of a sudden recognized as a place that was making a stand for democracy. And so, politicians and institutions can be rewarded for that. I think there's no doubt about that. And so, the question of what Democrats should be doing, and this was your question of looking forward to 2026 or fighting now, in some ways, first of all, I think in some way those are compatible if we think if we think politicians and institutions are rewarded for democracy. But it's also the case that we need to be looking forward to making sure we have free and fair elections in 2026, right? So that's the nightmare scenario, right? Is if we lose free and fair elections, and I think that's the situation we're in, where unfortunately we are, that is an open question, right? Is about how free and fair those elections are going to be. because Trump has shown that there is no boundary that he won't cross, right? We've been talking about this for 8 years, and he's done things now that would have been unimaginable even in his first term, right? I mean, we started off by talking about these, but there's some of the grossest violations of civil liberties any of us have seen in our lifetime, right? Sending people overseas without trial, occupying American cities. These are all things that would have been unimaginable in previous decades in American history. And so would he disrupt elections? I mean, I don't have anything to believe is stopping him now other than pushback. And so this is my point about having to say we have to stand up to this authoritarian creep now in order for us to have those elections. So if Democrats just keep saying this is normal politics, and we're not going to focus on saying, hey, what Donald Trump is doing is unconstitutional, what he's doing is actually turning us into an authoritarian country, and doing what politicians need to do, which is lead public opinion on those issues, then there will continue to be no line in which Donald Trump won't cross. And eventually that may get to these elections that we're putting our hope for democracy on.
Does the if they allow people to vote, but the gerrymandering is done in every state the way, is that a free and fair election?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, constitutionally, unfortunately, yes. I mean, because this is a flaw in our system, right? States have the ability to draw these lines, and going back to the Supreme Court, recently, within the last decade, they decided that political gerrymandering was something that the court had no role in policing, and so now courts can or the legislatures can gerrymander as much as they want, and of course the prediction is that they will now allow them, by gutting the Voting Rights Act, that they will essentially allow them to racially gerrymander. And that is, some of those seats that are not guaranteed to Democrats, but some of those seats are guaranteed to African American voters in the South that are voting Democrat, are some of the only reasons that Democrats have seats in some of these southern states like Alabama and Louisiana and places like that. And those would either be greatly reduced or possibly reduced to zero in some of those states. And so, if a part, so the deeper question, what you're asking, is that a free or fair election? It's a constitutional election. But, the United States operated under that same constitution, not as a full democracy for a long time. We know that, right? We had elections where, for a long time, half the population couldn't vote because of gender. Even more than half the population, and another large portion of the population couldn't vote because of race. And, there were lots of reasons it wasn't operating as full democracy. And if we're moving back into that situation where voters' representation is essentially non-existent because they have no chance of winning an election, then it's hard to call that a full democracy. And there's so many things that are going on in parallel here, where we have this authoritarian takeover from the executive, but we have this sort of creeping situation of gerrymandering that undermines our democracy from an electoral side. And it's hard to fight all these all these battles at once. And I think one thing I say is, unfortunately, one way to think about this is that these are two things that may be at cross purposes, because I understand, and I think ultimately I'm in favor of Democrats that want to start gerrymandering too, to make up for the Republican gerrymandering. Like, this is what's going on. California is going to start redrawing its lines probably. But in the long run, that is damaging for our democracy as well, right? Because we'd be undermining votes in California in the same way we would in Texas. And if we get through this authoritarian moment with Donald Trump, then that is something I think in the long term we really need to look at, because you can't have parties locking themselves into power in a way that they're not responsive to voters.
Let me finish on another topic, which is related to all this, but it's higher education. You've been very eloquent in calling for Harvard to not comply and to not fold and to not do whatever Trump asked, and I appreciate that work. So I guess the couple things in the news this week, I'm going to start there. Is one is that you've had like 8 or 9 colleges, maybe a bunch of colleges, that they have rejected this sort of quote unquote compact with Trump, where basically you'd jump the line for federal funding if you agreed to all their policies. So that was good. On the other hand, you had UVA basically comply with a bunch of sort of Trump requests. Higher ed feels like it's resisting more than it did in January because it was doing nothing then. But how do you feel about higher ed as a sector right now?
Well, I'm of very many different minds on this, so I'll try to
Okay.
give you a somewhat coherent answer. So, the UVA thing is very disheartening, right? And some people have pointed to this, and this is new news. I don't know how many people have actually looked at this. I always put agreement in quotation marks because what
Right.
it is an extortionary demand and an extortionary payment. Is This is essentially what Trump is doing to these universities. But people often people haven't looked at the details of that, but the people that have said, "Oh, it doesn't sound so bad," right? And this is the and I think and some people are saying, "Oh, some people in Virginia even think this is positive," and I think that shows you how far down this path towards authoritarianism we've gone, where we're essentially congratulating ourselves on holding on to some of our rights, right? And we're saying, "Oh, we're accepting the fact that we're negotiating over our rights." And in a democracy, you do not negotiate over your rights. You don't negotiate the authoritarian away, right? That's not a democracy when we're doing that. And they did that on the heels of having their president run out by the Trump administration, right? And when the and so they've already given up
They've
their
already
independence,
conceded blood,
and
right?
now they're doing that, right? So that's a very bad thing. On the other hand, I think what we're seeing, and this is what you mentioned, is that the compact. A lot of universities have rejected this compact, and they did so somewhat collectively. And something that people like me have been calling for months is that higher education has to unite as a sector, right? They have to get together and push back as a sector. And I think one reason that this is important is that a lot of people out there for a lot of different reasons don't care about higher education, but is a clear target of authoritarians. And that's one piece of evidence that we know Donald Trump is operating as authoritarian is he's trying to shut down higher education. This is what happened in Hungary, it's what happened in Turkey, it's what happened in Nazi Germany, is people they've gone after universities. Yet universities in the United States, especially because we have such a vibrant field of higher education, have a true identity that allows for collective action potential. I mean, we're all friends. We all know each other. These university presidents know each other,
Yeah.
and they can get together, and they're not competitive against each other in exactly the same way like business is. Who are always trying to look for a leg up. They have some sort of higher principle that unites them, at least in theory. And they can get together and actually be that collective bulwark of civil society that can push back on people like Trump. And, you know, there's a lot of things that, make me worried about that because they haven't done that super effectively at
Right.
all times. But I think that one thing we've seen this at places like Harvard, for example, is that the scholars in higher education who normally, we want to spend our time in our books and our computers are really finding their voice about these things. And it took us a little while to find our feet, but they've been really successful and they've really pushed back in a way that is making our leaders accountable. So, these lawsuits, for example, that Harvard won against Trump, one thing that people don't often recognize about those is those were actually started by Harvard professors. It wasn't the Harvard administration that sued
Oh,
Trump.
interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it was Harvard professors, and then the university itself actually joined, right? And so this was this example where if you would have asked me like 3 years ago if a bunch of Harvard professors would get together and say they were going to sue, have enough joint collective action to sue the the United States, I would have said, there's no way that's going to happen. But they found their voice. Harvard had an AAUP chapter that all of a sudden, this is the American Association of University Professors. And this is almost like a labor union for professors that has sort of tried. The reason it was put together at Harvard was to try to protect professors, protect things like the value of higher education, our free speech as professors, our academic freedom, and has played a real important role in resistance. And so it's not just Harvard, but it's places across the country where, in some ways, the people that really have a stake in this, who are the faculty and the
Hmm.
students, are coming together in a way that I think is providing some counterweights to what's going on with the Trump administration. And so I think if we can continue our voice, I think that that's going to be a powerful pushback in a way that, frankly, things like corporate America are not really capable of.
Final thing I want to talk about is, I think one of my colleagues, former colleagues at the Post, wrote this piece about this idea that I think if you did a survey of faculty at most universities, you'd find the overwhelming majority of faculty voted for Harris instead of
Mm.
Trump. And so
Right.
I think that this has led this claim that that universities increase quote unquote viewpoint diversity.
Mm.
And so talk about that idea. Like I guess I'm uncomfortable with the idea that we're sort of hinting universities should kind of ask people what their politics are and then hire them accordingly and add 50-50. On the other hand, I used to complain when universities or other institutions had 2% black people. So I think there is
Sure.
something, there's a tricky thing here. Is like diversity is good. viewpoint diversity is probably good. I don't necessarily want to have us counting who voted for who. So how do we have diversity, quote unquote, without going into like bad methods of that?
Okay, so yeah, so Perry, I could talk about this at length, so you'll have to cut me off if
All
I
right.
get going because
Yeah.
this is something I've thought a lot about. And
Okay.
so let me say the first most important thing, which is the federal government has zero business in trying to regulate the ideology of university faculty. That is full stop, right?
I guess their symbol is we give lots of money to universities, so we get to implement. We get to talk about how they implement. That's their argument.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. But what that is that is the government using coercion to put an ideological test on a private entity or even a public entity. And both those things have been a plain reading of the Constitution tells you that's against the Constitution, but the courts have ruled on this very clearly, right? And it's an affront to democracy to say that we're going to go in and measure the ideology of the people that work somewhere and therefore have and then control how much money they have. And just to put another point on this, which I think is important to talk about, is one reason this is authoritarian in some way is that universities actually are a very small recipient of federal dollars in the grand scheme of things. So if you want to talk about places that receive a lot of federal dollars, we should look at, for example, our defense industry. So one of all of the biggest recipients of federal dollars are Boeing, increasingly Elon Musk's various corporations, places like that. And nobody's doing an ideological test in Boeing, right?
Right.
If you went and looked at the corporate board of Boeing, what do you think their, voting patterns are, right? And so this is targeted at a certain group, and that's an affront to democracy. We can't do that. That's full stop. Now, there's another question, which is a separate question that I think is a very good one, which is how should universities be if we want to operate to be the best that we can be, if we want to fulfill our mission to educate and to research. And I actually personally think that having something that approaches something closer to ideological balance is actually really important for that. If you looked at sort of my, often now when I talk about universities, I'm somebody that, comes on to talk about how they should be resisting the Trump administration. But if you went back a few years and you kind of looked for things that people quoted me on, it was often about this issue. I would say that universities we'd be doing a service to ourselves and to our students and actually improve our public view if we could find ways to become more ideologically balanced. And so I really think that's important. Now, there's a question of how do we get there, and that's more complicated
Because
because
it would almost like it'd be hard for a black woman in America currently to get hired if the search is for a Republican because there are very few. That's kind of where I get nervous about
yeah,
it.
exactly. This is the
Yeah.
problem, right? It becomes
Yeah.
self-reinforcing, right? So let's say you're a smart, young person and you're interested in things at the academy, some kind of pursuit in the sciences or the social sciences or even the humanities. And you look around, you say, well, but I'm a conservative. Do I want to go into that? And you can understand why they wouldn't, right? And so, I wouldn't, like if I was going to be an extreme minority and even potentially have my ideas sort of looked down on and mocked. And that does happen at universities. We have to be honest about that we often disparage conservative ideas, right? And so those things that's a true state of the world, and it makes it hard to overcome this problem. As I said, you absolutely cannot overcome that with some kind of government interference. That's like, full stop. That's the end of the world. But universities need to take a serious look at this. And, people, there's a really bad taste in our mouth right now to talk about, like, people throw around this phrase like affirmative action for conservatives, and at the same time we're stripping away race-based affirmative action. That just sounds absurd, right? And I can understand why people don't want to go down that path, because the idea that those are two things we'd be doing at the same time sound almost like an affront to both ideas in many ways. So I think the way we need to think about this as a university is to take a step back from the current moment we're in, where we're being pressured by an authoritarian, and say, what is the way that we would approach this if we had an approach as an intellectual problem, right? Something that's a long-term problem that we have to solve for the good of our universities, and in many ways for the good of the place of universities in our society. And ultimately, we might say that we want to do things where we can think about ways to get more conservatives on faculty, to have more sort of conservative voices among our students, and all those things. I think that would make us stronger in the end, but it's not an easy problem to solve. In the same way that, like, I don't like this parallel, but it's one that people have talked about, and you mentioned it when you first started, about how things like bringing in racial and gender equality at universities. I want to be clear, this isn't the same thing. I don't think of politics as a protected class, but we wanted more racial diversity and more gender diversity at universities because it made us stronger, right? Universities were worse off in the 1960s when they're all white men
Right.
and when they became more diverse. And I think we'd be stronger if we were more politically diverse too. And that was a hard problem to solve then, and we figured it out. And this is a hard problem to solve now, but I think we can figure it out in a way that would make us stronger in the long run.
But I guess JD Vance would say, "We've given you time to solve this problem. You're not solving it, so now we're going to solve it for you by." That's kind of right. This is not a new issue. If this is not a new issue that academia is considered too left and overwhelming left, I don't know that it's a bit. The I guess there wasn't a new problem in 1960 that academia was very white. So I guess that's okay. Yeah,
No,
yeah,
that's
right,
right.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's a
yeah,
hard problem, and
yeah,
and
yeah,
and but you're not going to you're not going to solve it by an authoritarian attack.
yeah,
That's for
right,
sure, right?
yeah,
And one thing that we have to say really clearly here is, unfortunately, the idea of ideological diversity has also been conflated with this idea of things like free speech, for example,
yeah,
right?
right,
And so, often you read this compact on higher education that Donald Trump put forth, and it talked about how they, in the same paragraph, it talked about controlling the ideology of faculty and then said free speech is very
right,
important,
right.
right?
Yes.
And so we have to be very clear that Donald Trump and JD Vance and people in that circle, they don't care about free speech actually, and they don't actually care about ideological diversity either. What they want is they want universities to be more in their image, and we can see this in the way that faculty have been pressured to be punished, have lost their jobs because of things they say. We've seen this in a lot of red states now, and and those two issues ultimately have to be separated. And if we let people that don't actually care about ideological diversity and don't actually care about free speech, but are just using those as fronts in order to shape universities in their image, and we're going down a very dangerous road. And so I think those of us that actually care about ideological diversity from the perspective of saying that will make us stronger pedagogically, it will make us stronger researchers, it'll make us people that hear from more diverse ideas, which always make us smarter. We have to solve it from that perspective of truly caring about it, not from some sort of political mission.
Let me ask, we use the term last thing, ideological diversity and conservatives. We've sort of conflated these things, but I grew up. I went to a black church when I was a kid. Like
Yeah,
the people were not super. It was working class. People were not super politically engaged. We all probably voted for. Most people voted for the Democratic candidate, but there was actually a fair amount of disagreement about how should schools work, the police, etc. So I guess versus I worked at the Washington Post in the opinion section. We had a range of from Hillary Clinton to Jeb Bush. I don't know that was we had more partisan diversity. I don't know if we had more when I guess I'm nervous about the idea that there are two ideologies in America. We need to balance those out as opposed to there being a broad, like a lot of black institutions have plenty of people who think differently. They might
right.
just not have a part like when we say I hope we mean actually a mix of socialists,
Sure.
libertarians, not
Yeah.
just R and D, which I think is we have two parties. We shouldn't reduce everyone's thinking to that, in my view, at least. I just want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, look, I 100% agree with you, and I think this is part of the problem when we try to approach these issues not from a perspective of what are we actually trying to accomplish intellectually, but from the perspective of how are we going to gain political points, or in Trump's perspective, how are we actually going to try to shut down criticism in the way authoritarians do and try to shape American institutions in his image. I mean, that's what he's trying to do, right? And when we respond to that, rather than thinking about it from the perspective of what are we trying to accomplish and what are our goals, then we end up reducing it to these sort of reductionist paradigms like, oh, we just need to balance conservatives, and Republicans, and Democrats. And if you think about institutions in America, institutions aren't set up that way, right? The NRA doesn't have Democrats, running around as board. The ACLU, unfortunately, I think it would be better if they did, but in this day and age, they don't have a ton of Republicans, right? But it's not clear from an intellectual perspective that institutions should be set up with
Yeah,
partisan balance. But what you're asking, I think, is what the way universities should be, which is, should we have something that allows for an exchange of different ideas across different viewpoints?
yeah,
Now, one important thing to mention is that you know, universities actually, and this is part of the problem because this has become politicized, is this is seen as there's this caricature of universities, right? Where we're all like, somewhere in between like, socialists and Marxist or something like that, right? And that's our ideological diversity. And of course, that's not true,
That's
right?
not true in the first
Your
place, right?
your
The
median
business
faculty member at
school is
Harvard,
not full of Marxists, obviously,
right?
yeah.
Median faculty member is kind of a center left person. And a
Right.
lot of those, 20 years ago probably would have been Republicans, right? Because a lot of them are kind of, rich folks that have a lot invested in the system. And it's just the Republican Party's moved away from them, right? So they're kind of now they find themselves as Democrats. And that's true. There's some radicals running around here, but that's diversity,
Yes.
right? That's part of what make we radicals are part of the diversity too, right? And so, there is that kind of exchange of ideas, and you're absolutely right. And I think that one thing we should be measuring, right, is, when we think about this problem is what is actual ideological diversity? Let's just not measure everybody and ask who they voted for.
Right. Right.
Because there's a lot of people that disagree. And in one way, because that's just, it's reducing things to a binary. And yeah, they
It's a
all voted
binary, right?
yeah, they all voted for Harris, but there's a lot of diversity in there, right? And in some ways, you can see this. This all goes on in the backdrop, for example, of what happened in the last couple of years on campuses around the country with these, with the protests and the conflicts over the war in Gaza, right? And you look at and people treated this as a bad thing, where we had all these protests on campus and people talked about this tension on universities. But to me, in many ways, that was the success of diversity in universities. Like, look what happened. I mean, we had
No
people with
disagreement. Yeah.
wildly, yeah, it was a very touchy subject, and we had people, and many institutions aren't like this, and this is why they didn't experience this. We had people with wildly different worldviews, right? We have people from different parts of the world. We have Jewish Israelis, we have Arab Palestinians, we have people from other parts of those countries. We have people from different religious backgrounds. We have people who are deeply conservative when it comes to these issues in the Middle East. We have people that are very liberal when it comes to these issues in the Middle East, and we're all existing in the same community, right? And we're trying to sort these out. And every once in a while, people get kind of angry and yell at each other, but that's really rare. And the rest of the time, they're just making their voices heard. Some of them are protesting one direction, some are protesting another direction. Sometimes they're coming in the classroom and having respectful debates about these things. And that's actually happening almost nowhere else in America. And that's actually a really amazing thing. And you can point to all kinds of other issues that people come here and have diverse viewpoints on and argue about. And that's actually like an amazing success
Because that's not a
of
DNR
universities.
issue. I hadn't thought of it that way. That
Yeah, it's
issue
not
is
a
not
DNR issue,
DNR, so it's
right?
more complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, one way to frame this whole conversation we're having, and this is often lost, so I'm glad, you give me an opportunity to talk about it, is we talk about these universities being these very, single-minded and closed-minded places, and that's a complete mischaracterization. I would argue that we are some of the most open-minded, wildly diverse thinking places in the entire country, if not the world, right? People come here and they argue about stuff, and they have different viewpoints. They come from amazingly diverse backgrounds. I think it's a problem, and we started the conversation this way to say that we're voting, 95% for one party, and I wish we voted more broadly. But to reduce that to saying that we are a ideologically constrained place or something like that, or a place that has no disagreement or has groupthink or something, I think is just absurd.
Because I guess you had like 5 parties like other countries. I guess on the
Of course.
Harvard campus, the most right-wing candidate would probably not give me votes on the Harvard campus. That is a problem that person, but the other 4 parties might get some, yeah.
Yeah, they would. And look, if the Republican Party moved back to the center in the United States, I mean, of course they would get more votes at places like Harvard, right? I mean, this isn't, we can't, expect people to follow the party as it moves one direction, And one way to put this is, one of the things we value in the United States, and actually I think this is something that ultimately hopefully can get us through this moment, is we have a lot of value in things like civic education and understanding, the principles of democracy and places of things like that. And people we teach things like that at Harvard. Our professors understand that and things like that. And as the Republican Party has moved away from that, especially in the last year, and completely abandoned that, then you can understand why people aren't willing to put their name behind that, right? But it doesn't mean there's not conservatives on campus. It doesn't mean there's not people that, given another situation, would vote for conservative policies, and that's okay, right? We have conservatives and liberals in the world. I'm not a conservative, but there are people that are out there and they have legitimate ideas, and we can compete in elections to see who wins, but we have to have a party that believes in democracy first, and one of them has moved away from it.
Ryan, this was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I feel like I've learned a lot. Hopefully the audience has too. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It was great.
Good to see you.